we could start with your full name, please.
Frank William Ockenfels, Jr.
And can you spell your last name for me?
Ockenfels.
And where and when were you born?
Staten Island, New York, on October 27th, 1925.
So how old are you today?
93.
And which branch of the military did you serve with?
The U.S. Army.
And what was your rank within the Army?
Well, of course, I went in as private first class. I mean, I went in as a recruit, became a private first class, and gradually upgraded until I was released in 1946, at which point I was Master Sergeant.
And what year did you join the Army?
1943.
So 43 to 46.
Right.
Okay. And what unit were you attached to in the Army?
Well, eventually it was the 69th Infantry Division, based in Mississippi. Camp Shelby, Mississippi was where it was formed.
Mm-hmm. And you remember which company you served with?
Well, during the service, when I was attached to the 69th Infantry, yes, we were in the 273rd Regiment of that division, in the 1st Battalion, Company C, Heavy Weapons Platoon, and my assignment was a sniper. Not because I'd ever had any experience with a firearm, but through basic training, they suddenly decided I could be a sniper.
So they chose you for that job?
Yes.
Okay. And did you serve with the 69th?
Yes, through the whole period.
Okay. So I'd like to rewind a little bit. We'll talk about your childhood growing up on Staten Island in New York. Can you tell me about your parents, who they were?
Well, my parents lived in the Lighthouse Department on Staten Island. This was the 3rd Lighthouse District. There were 2 homes on the property. One was for the general manager, and the second was for the assistant general manager. My dad was the assistant general manager. So we grew up in a government-provided house. There were 3 of us, my father, mother, and myself, and we had 21 rooms in this house. 21 rooms because every time the job turned over, the new man who came in was given a budget to increase the size or whatever of the house. So they kept adding room after room after room. Thus, we had this huge house for just the 3 of us. My sister was not with us because she was 12 years older, and she was away at school, and so I grew up without really seeing very much of her.
Did you grow up seeing very much of anybody else? Was it pretty isolated?
There were no other. There was only one other family. They had no children. My playmates were all the workers in the property, the government workers, craftsmen of all kinds, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and so forth. Because this base supplied all of the aids to navigation, buoys, lighthouses, that sort of thing, from Maine to Puerto Rico, in this huge base on Staten Island.
And to what age did you live there?
Well, we lived there until my dad retired, which was probably in let's say 39. 39 maybe, yeah. He retired and then we moved to a private home in Staten Island.
So you were about 13, 14 years old.
Right.
So what would you do for fun?
For fun. Well, the most fun I had was to go out and join the fellows who were in the toll booth just outside the gate of our property. Outside the gate of our property were the toll booths for the ferry going to Brooklyn or to Staten Island. And these toll booth guys kind of adopted me, and my biggest fun was standing there getting money, giving out tickets, and they just sat there and luxuriated while I did all the work. But I had a lot of fun.
So you didn't really have any other children to play with?
No, no.
Did you have any jobs early on?
No, we had no pets.
No, did you work? Did you have any jobs? No paper routes or anything
Oh,
of
yeah.
that nature?
Had a paper route. When I went to school, I had to take the bus. I had to go outside the gate of the property, get on a public bus to go down to Stapleton to PS14. Excuse me. PS14, which was the school I started in. It was the same school that my sister had gone to and also my mother. So I had some of the teachers who, not too many, but a couple who knew my mother and my sister, which was kind of unusual because they, of course, tried to match me with their experience with my sister and my mother.
Different experience?
Well, the experience is like you're a dummy compared to your sister or your mother. No, it was just a little unusual. I kind of had in my mind all the time that they knew my mother and they knew my sister. I had to be very careful.
So you guys had a lighthouse on the property that you grew up on?
No. This was purely a supply base.
Okay.
The only lighthouse was down in Richmond, Staten Island.
But it was a lighthouse district, as you call
Yes,
it?
the third lighthouse district.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the lighthouse itself was down in Richmond, at the far south end of Staten Island.
And was your father in the military at all?
Yes, the lighthouse department was taken over by the Coast Guard, and he became a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard, then assigned to 42 Broadway, where they had their Coast Guard had their administrative headquarters, and he was the director of aids to navigation. At that point, my parents divorced, and he worked in New York and lived in Brooklyn, and I lived on Staten Island with my mother. And that was true until probably 1943 or 4, when the Coast Guard was taken over by the Navy. So my dad went back into service. He had retired, went back into service, changed from Coast Guard to Navy, and then retired as a commander in the Navy.
Was that hard on you when your parents split up?
Well, yes and no. I lived with my mother, which was fine. We got along very well. I was very busy, paper routes again, working in a garage, which took up an awful lot of my time. And of course, I was going to school. We lived 2 blocks from school, so that was nice. Curtis High School, C-U-R-T-I-S. beyond that, the breakup was, I didn't see him very often. I don't know if they ever had an arrangement which would necessitate having me as their child every other weekend or something like that. That was never an issue. I spent very little time with him.
Was that common even before they split up?
No, it was after.
After.
Yeah.
So you had enough distractions to keep you busy and.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you only had the one sister?
Yes. Yeah, she died at 102, 2.5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And did you graduate from high school?
No, not at that point. I left high school at the end of the third year to go. I was getting ready to go into service. I wanted to get into the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
So I left high school, and again, I'm living with my mother. She has minimum amount of control, so I was on my own, and I decided I was going to leave high school, and I did. And I went to a school for Air Force, which was the Casey Jones School of Aeronautics in Newark, New Jersey. So I signed up for that, and turned out it was a school for airline mechanics. I went to the school for about 2 months, probably. And this was quite a commute to Newark, New Jersey and back every day. And I was not enthralled with the school or the curriculum, and so I left because I had a side job. I was driving a taxi. And the money was so good, and I was so disenchanted with the Casey Jones School of Aeronautics that I quit the school and went full-time driving cab. And I did that right up until the time I went into the service.
You were only 17 years old?
Yeah. Well, I was one of the first people in the state of New York to get a chauffeur's license at age 17. And they had to lower the age because everybody else had gone into service. So they decided to lower it to 17, and there I was. And I think probably I had the first license, chauffeur's license in New York State for somebody 17 years of age.
So growing up during the Great Depression, your dad worked for the government.
Right.
So his job was
Secure.
pretty secure. I know it seems like you guys kind of lived very isolated.
Yeah, isolated and really unattached, unaware of the Depression.
So it didn't affect you guys
No.
probably as much as it did?
No.
Do you have any memories of that time of maybe things that you heard that you didn't necessarily experience, but?
No, I don't think so. No. Life was pretty complete. And I don't think I ever wanted for anything. So the Depression kind of was all around me, but I was unaware and unaffected.
Now, were you a pretty imaginative kid growing up?
I don't think so.
No. I think you'd have to use your creativity to stay entertained at times and not having other kids around, maybe.
Well, I don't know what I did with my time, to tell you the truth. It would seem to be ample opportunity for lots of things to go on, but I don't recall there was very much, except I spent a lot of time with the workers on the base.
Mm-hmm.
And that involved, I was on the shore and on and off ships all the time. Boats, I should say. They weren't ships. They were small boats. and I was the assistant superintendent's son, so they had to be very careful with me. I fell overboard a couple of times, and they had to get me back on the deck or on a pier, get my clothes off, throw them over a boiler somewhere to dry them, send me home before my parents found out that I had fallen overboard. But
probably best that they didn't know that, huh?
no, they never found out.
So, do you remember where you were December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Yeah,
Do you
I
remember?
was in Madison Square Garden watching the Sandpoint hockey team. This was the farm team for the hockey team from New York.
The Rangers?
Rangers, yeah. This farm team for the Rangers was the Sandpoint something or other. And we were in the stadium, in the auditorium watching the game, and the game was called for a moment. The announcer said that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and that all military personnel were required to return to their base immediately. So people from all over got up and had to leave, That was my only affiliation with Pearl Harbor, yeah.
And you were too young at the time
Yeah,
to enlist.
yeah.
Did you know where Pearl Harbor was?
No.
And was there any inclination to you that it would turn out, or that event, I guess, would trigger such a...
Well, I guess at that point I thought about, gee, I'll need to get into service pretty soon, because at that point I think I was 16 or 17, and my 18th birthday would be coming up. I had already registered for the draft, so I had my draft papers, and I was talking to my dad about this Air Force school I was going to go to. He encouraged me to think about the Coast Guard Academy because he could have some effect in helping me through there. But of course I was better than all that. I knew more than that. So I decided I wanted to go to the Air Force, so I went to the school. I quit the school, and my 18th birthday was coming up, and I decided I would just go down and ask for immediate, what do they call it? Induction, yeah. So at age 18, I would be inducted immediately. Wasn't immediate, but it was about a week later, and I spent Thanksgiving in Camp Upton, New York.
So what was your initial attraction to the Air Force? Did you want to be a pilot?
I didn't want to get into the infantry, where I ended up, of course. Yeah. No. There was nothing except the Air Force seemed to be a lot better in terms of how they treated their personnel. No.
But that didn't work out.
That didn't work out, and I was inducted, and therefore I was in the Army at age 18.
But what about as far as the Navy goes? I mean, you grew up around, it seems like it would only be natural to...
No interest in the Navy or the Coast Guard. No.
But you wanted to serve, you wanted to support your country, and...
Yes, and I thought that I knew best how to do it, and that was to have voluntary induction in the Army. I didn't know where I was going to go from there, where I'd be assigned, whatever. But I went in at age 18, went to Camp Upton. From Camp Upton, we went to down in Jersey, and then I ended up in basic training was in Fort McClellan, Alabama. So I was originally assigned to the infantry. Went to Fort McClellan, Alabama From there, I went through basic training. That was 13 weeks. After that 13 weeks, I was transferred to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, because they were just forming the 69th Infantry Division. That's where I ended up.
Anything significant that stands out in your memory from your basic training or your?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
I'd had a lot of close order drill because I was a Boy Scout. And in the 1939 World's Fair, they recruited, about 500 scouts. This was in 38, I should say. They recruited about 500 scouts, and the expectation was that we were going to be kind of courtesy guides within the fair, helping people to locate where they wanted to go. Well, it turns out that no, they weren't going to do that at the end. But in the meantime, every Saturday we went from Staten Island out to Flushing to fairgrounds, and we did close order drill training with a little British major, a British Army major, and he taught us close order drill. He stood up on a platform in front of 500 of us, and he spoke without any amplification. And this was one of the things that he wanted every one of us to do, to be able to speak, and to speak loudly so that people could hear us, Unbelievable. Anyway, after about a year of this, when the fair opened, the only use for the Boy Scouts was a Boy Scout camp within the Flushing Meadows. And let's see, I guess the first thing that happened was when it opened, I was not in the camp. This group of 500 had kind of disbanded by then. But Macy's was looking for some people to help work out in their property on the fairgrounds. And I went to work in the storeroom of Macy's. I'm still only 17. And I worked there for, probably 6 or 8 months. And went back to driving a cab again. There was more money in it. It was more profitable. So I drove the cab up until the point I went into the Army. But the point of all this is that this close order drill that we were given as Boy Scouts blended very well with basic training. And they would pluck me out of the crowd sometimes and make me a student leader for calisthenics and marching. So I enjoyed that. That was fun. I lost.
A bit of familiarity.
Yeah. And I think I lost 20 pounds maybe, just in basic training, which put me in good shape, took all the blubber away, and let's see, what else?
So it sounds like they pegged you as a leader pretty early on.
Yeah.
They recognized that you had that in you.
Well, I had had some basic training in close order drill. Mm-hmm. And so they put me to use with that, yeah. But
that... Did you, was it later on that, because you mentioned that you were a sniper?
Well, I was in, not in basic training, I don't think.
They probably want to cover that.
Well, we did some rifle work in basic training, yes. And from that, I guess, they thought from my record that I could be a sniper. So when I was sent to Camp Shelby, Mississippi to join the 69th Infantry Division, I came in as a potential sniper. That put me into the regiment, the battalion, the company, Company C, and eventually into the heavy weapons platoon, because the heavy weapons platoon had machine guns, mortars, and a sniper.
Now, was that based on your accuracy, or what other attributes were you pegged as
Had to
potential
be on
sniper?
accuracy, yeah.
And is there a different rifle, a sniper rifle?
Yes, yeah. It's an .03 rifle with a sniper scope, and that was the problem, because when we got into Germany, and the first assignment we had as a company was to take pillboxes on the Siegfried line. And the best way to do it, they thought, was to do it at night. So we would approach the pillbox in the cover of darkness, take Bangalore torpedo and band them together and kind of prop them inside the aperture of a pillbox, blow it up, and then we could advance through the Siegfried line. Well, I was well, but when you have a .03 rifle with a scope on it, in the darkness you can't see anything. Today you can. They have operations how they can do that. But at that point they couldn't, and I couldn't. I wasn't able to do anything. So the first opportunity I had was to find an American who had been shot and killed, and he had a BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and so I picked that up and gradually assembled all of the accoutrements that went with it. The suspender held ammunition belt and so forth, and the ammunition, and became a BAR man instead of a sniper for the rest of the war.
And
Boy, isn't that boring?
not at all.
Well, I've heard this all before.
And let's see here. Did your transition into a BAR man, did that occur shortly after you guys held positions at the Siegfried line?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I was totally unable to do anything with a sniper rifle because all of our operations were at night in the dark, and so that didn't work. So I had to have something else.
Right. Okay, so I understand. Let's see. So you guys arrived in England December of '44.
Sorry.
No?
Yes.
They're gonna go if you want to go.
Can I go?
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Ooh, your glasses. Okay,
Oh, it won't be the same without you.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right, well,
Diane
carry
grabbed-
on.
Diane grabbed you first too. So
Oh,
she
good,
has-
thank you. Okay, see you later.
Okay.
Be
How
careful going
long
down
will
the
you be
stairs.
here?
Generally takes a few hours.
Oh, okay.
You'll probably be back when
Yeah,
it goes.
okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Just be careful going down the stairs.
Yeah, I will.
Have fun.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
I'll be able to sleep eternity. I may have trouble falling out, but it'll work.
So you guys arrived in England
Yeah.
December of '44. Is that about right?
Yes. Yes, we had Thanksgiving dinner on the ship.
Okay. So before you guys shipped out, when were you aware that you guys would be headed to Europe?
Oh, we were told we were going to be, going to Europe, because the bulge hadn't started yet. But I guess they felt that they were going to need extra troops there anyway. And so we were told early on that we were going to be going to Europe, yeah.
And did you have any thoughts or feelings about that in particular?
No, not really.
Just go where they told you.
Yeah.
And have you guys been sort of following along with the war and how things have been progressing up until that point, or were you mainly focused on your training and preparing to be?
I was more inward. There was more training experiences and discussions and thoughts about that. Very little thought about what the progress was of the war, except it was still going on and the Germans were still a threat. and that was about it. Yeah.
Okay. So you arrived in England in December. Um, did you guys do some more training over there?
Yes. Yes. We were on a World War I British air base in Quonset huts. That's where we lived for probably a month, and that put us January into France, France to Belgium, and the last week in January we were on the Siegfried line.
And did you guys go through Le Havre in France?
Yes.
Okay.
Remember the terrible experience of debarking, getting off the troop ship down to a boat that would take us ashore, and we had to climb down those webbed cargo nets that they threw over the side. They became ladders, and with the BAR, which is about 25 pounds or more, and all of the ammunition belts and cartridges, I was carrying probably close to 75 pounds, plus my backpack, and climbing down that damned cargo net was really a problem. I'll never forget that. But I made it into the boat finally. We got ashore. All was all okay.
So you guys aren't sitting still while this is happening. The boats are rocking and
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Was the biggest challenge having all that weight on you?
Yeah, that was the challenge.
So you were carrying the Browning rifle with you at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, wait a minute. No, that's all imagination. No, I didn't get the Browning automatic rifle until we were on the front lines, and that was the end of January. So here we are in Le Havre. No, I would have my sniper's rifle and my pack, that's all. Yeah. But
sure
coming
you're still
down
carrying a lot of weight on you.
Yeah, I was not that agile.
So as you guys sailing across the channel, are there any thoughts in your head? Anything you remember about getting closer to seeing combat and what that might be like for you?
I don't think so. I think we were more excited about where we were going to be, and here we were in England. That was interesting, but we did have some free time and were able to go to London.
Mm-hmm.
We were in Winchester is where the base was. We could take a train and go to London when we had free time. We made that trip a couple of times, and that introduced us to pubs. Of course.
I know England has some good pubs. But you guys didn't spend much time there until getting.
Yeah, it wasn't very
assignment.
much time. A couple of weeks, and then we went to France. At that point, it was the weather was terrible and rainy, and we were in tents in this camp in France with nothing but mud, just awful. Couldn't wait to get out of there. I remember going for mess, and we'd tromp through the mud, and we'd get to the mess line, and you weren't sure whether you were getting mud or food in your canteen. Oh, it was awful.
So it lived up to its name then. Huh?
Yeah. We went from there to the Hurtgurn Forest, where we were stationed at that point, ready to move in after the bulge. This was maybe a week after the bullet. And at this point, the Germans were retreating, starting to retreat, but they were still firing at the American forces. So we were in the Hurtgern forest in these foxholes with wooden structures, limbs from trees that built these kind of covers over the foxholes. And the screaming Mimis would come in day and night, just going crazy, taking down all of the branches and whatnot in this heavily forested Hurtgern forest. So that was a displeasure, to say the least. And therefore they decided again to feed us, but only at night, when the Germans couldn't see anybody, couldn't see anything. And so we would go through the mess line at night, and you'd come along, and there'd be Jello, and there would be bean soup, and there would be something else all thrown together, basically, because you couldn't see, they couldn't see, they weren't allowed to have light. So we ended up with a tray full of peas and whatnot, all conglomerated together. That was not great.
Not great, but at least you had something to eat.
Yes, yeah.
So can we talk about when you guys arrived at the Siegfried Line?
Yeah.
You guys were there for, I understand, about 2 weeks or so.
Well, as we broke through the Siegfried Line, we had to take the pillboxes 1, 2, 3, 4 along the line. So at some point, I forget how many days we were there, but each night we would take a pillbox, and apparently then we were able to move through. And what we were doing then was chasing the Germans, and they were retreating and firing as they retreated. They were trying to hold ground.
So they had already made their last big offensive, essentially. Now they're moving backwards. And it was shortly after you arrived at the Siegfried Line that you gave up your sniper rifle and assembled.
Yes, immediately.
So, and you mentioned all your missions were at nighttime.
Yeah.
So what would you guys do during the daytime?
Well, basically, we were back in these foxholes waiting for the screaming Mimis to stop. And they just
cover and
yeah.
hoping one of those don't land on you. And can you take me through the process of approaching and then taking out these pillboxes?
Well, as you approach, there'd be a lot of fire toward an aperture to try and get the Germans to back away, so that we could get close enough to get the Bangalore torpedo into the aperture. They were, of course, reluctant to see those coming their way, so they would fire as best they could. But we'd have a heavy fire concentrated on a particular aperture, so they'd back off. We'd eventually get the torpedo in there, and at that point blow it up, and blow them up or blow them out of the pillbox.
So these were pretty coordinated efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And inside of those pillboxes they had machine guns firing back at you, rifles. What type of defense did they?
Well, of course, they were living quarters too.
Okay.
Inside, they had left very little. Whatever they had, they took with them in their retreat. So there wasn't much in the pillbox. I can't remember a picture of the inside of the pillbox, really. There's just nothing but, just as a structure. That was it.
And what was your role in this particular operation? Were you laying fire on the
I was laying
fire.
fire. I was laying fire against the apertures. Again, my O3 with the scope was no help, so with the BAR I had some automatic operation, so I was able to pinpoint where I wanted to go, even in the dark. Just head for that aperture and put as much rounds in there as you could. And while the other guys were moving these Bangalore torpedoes, which were about that long, they attached to one another. As you moved one along, you'd attach another, move another along. The guy at the front end was moving closer and closer to the aperture to get it inside. Once he got one part of the Bangalore inside, they set it off, and then it went all the way through and blew up the aperture and that part of the pillbox.
So how would you be able to see where your target was? Would you guys ever use flares to illuminate the pillbox, or?
Well, there was plenty of fire coming our way, so we could see where the fire was coming from, so that pinpointed where we wanted to put our fire. No, there was no light around it. There might have been a flare occasionally, but we couldn't rely on it. No.
And in your estimation, how many of these pillboxes would you take out per night or in total?
Oh, it would only take one per night.
Okay. So it's a pretty.
They were backed up. They were primary pillboxes, which were the ones on the front line. They were backed up by another pillbox, which wasn't quite as operational, didn't have as many apertures. It was smaller. Wasn't a. It might have been the living quarter versus the primary, which was nothing but military operation. The backup pillbox might be where they lived and ate. So, and they would retreat to those and try and hold those, and so the next night we'd have to take the backup pillbox. And eventually we got through. I would think, I don't think we took more than 3, our company. Probably 3 pillboxes. So that took, that took 4 or 5 days, during which the bulge was going on. So by the time we got through the forest, through the Siegfried line, through the forest, and up to what was then the front line, it was where the bulge had been. This was about a week later, and what we were doing is we were relieving the troops out who went through the bulge. And they were sent back to rest camp, and we were moved forward.
Now your first few days in combat, can you talk about that experience and
Well, it's not like we were fighting as the original troops had. In this case, since the Germans were retreating, they were moving back and leaving behind ammunition, artillery, that sort of thing. And all we were doing was occupying territory. So the goal was, they would say, if you want to have dinner tonight, you've got to take that town. And so that would be the operational focus, was for us to take that town, make sure it was cleared of all German soldiers, and as many civilians who were susceptible to the Nazis. And so that was it. We'd go from town to town to town.
But there was still a very real possibility of you getting killed doing what you were doing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did that ever weigh on you at all?
I don't think so, no. No. It was a matter of extermination, self-preservation, and achieving whatever goals had been established. Like, get that town.
There's a job to be done. And
do it, yeah.
And when did you receive your first promotion?
Well, it was after the war. And what happened after the war This was in May of 45. Our division, well, first of all, there had been a number of troops that had been there in the forefront of the war for much longer than we had. Not just the bulge, but the backup troops, the supplemental troops and units. And one was a ordnance department. That ordnance department had been overseas for, 2 years, I guess. And so they were going to send them home. So what they did was exchange the division for the department, and we all in our 69th Infantry became members of the ordnance group, and the 69th Division, composed of all these ordnance people, was sent back to the United States. So I was in the ordnance. Somehow I was picked to become a driver for a group leader. The group leader was a major. And the major lived in a house on one of the bases. I think it was Mannheim Ordnance Base, MOB, Mannheim Ordnance, Mannheim Ordnance Group, yeah. And so he lived in a house. He had a butler, and he had a driver. And I was the driver, and I had a small bedroom in the house. So this is pretty good living. And as a driver for a major, that called for a corporal. And so I was advanced to corporal so I could drive him. That was my first promotion.
Because after the war ended, you remained in Europe for a number of months.
I was there for the year of occupation, yeah. 45 to 46.
So rewinding a bit, after you guys had broken through the Siegfried Line
Mm-hmm.
and eventually made your way into Germany.
We're in Germany.
Yeah, but you guys started taking town after town?
Yeah. Clearing town after town, clearing them of all German equipment and German sympathizers.
And what was that experience like?
Well, that was unique because we weren't very conversant with German. We didn't speak German. And so we confronted homeowners. We lived in their houses. We cleared their houses and lived in them, and kind of separated them and sent them off to live with their relatives or neighbors or whatever while we were there, which was only for a day or so. Then we'd go move to the next town, do the same thing. We had no real good relationships with the locals, no. It was still a combative nature and feeling.
They weren't happy to see you guys.
No, they weren't happy with us, and therefore we weren't happy with them. And that went through until we met the Russians. Now, we got to the Fulda River, and that was the demarcation point between the Russians and the Americans, or the Allied troops. And so we sat in, what's the name of the town? Thinking of the name of the town we were in. Anyway, we're billeted in this town, and we couldn't cross the Fulda River. We were waiting for the Russians to appear, to come to their side, and then we would have joined forces. Of course, in the meantime, whoever was in between was forced over the river onto our side, and it was composed, of course, of Germans, civilians, who didn't want any part of the Russians, and they didn't really like us, but we were less
Lesser of two evils.
yeah. So we had a lot of interplay with that, with families and so forth. And we were living along the river was a railroad line, and there were railroad cars, and we were billeted in railroad cars for a week or two. And we were supposed not to let the Germans get across to retreat from the Russians. But we were soft-hearted at that point, and considering the choices they had, if we had those choices, we wouldn't want to be near the Russians either. So we were quite loose in letting them come across and come on our side. And then they just disappeared into the woodwork.
And these are the civilian,
Yeah.
German civilians you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Well, I hope they're all civilians, but of course they could have been German soldiers who converted themselves into civilian looks, and yeah.
So before you guys encountered the Russians, and you guys had to cross the Rhine River, correct?
Yes.
And I understand there was a fortress
Yeah.
that you guys.
Ehrenbreitstein.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, that was across the Rhine on the on the far side. We were on this side to get across. The engineers came up with the basis of their bridges, which are boats, tubs. They're like tubs that go across this way. Then they lay boards across, and that enables them to create a bridge. Well, they came up with all these tubs, and with with our equipment, we rowed our way across the Rhine with the Germans firing down on us from Fort Ehrenbreitstein, which was very high, and we had to get up that hill. And that was a day and a half to get up there. And crossing the Rhine at night, in the dark, in these tubs, paddling along with the butt end of your rifle or BAR. There were no paddles, of course.
What was the boat or the flotation device that you were crossing the river in? Was it a proper boat, or?
No, it was just a tub. It was like a bathtub, a large bathtub. And the engineers used those one after the other, tied together, and then they laid planking on the top, and that became a bridge.
You're rowing with your.
And we're using this tub as a boat individually and getting across, yeah.
So you're probably not moving very quickly.
No, it wasn't. No. The Rhine was not too wide at that point, so that was good.
And then once you made it across, you said it took you about a day and a half to.
Take over the fort, yeah.
Did you guys encounter heavy opposition there at all, or?
Well, it was enough that we didn't do anything during the day. We laid low during the day and then attempted to move up at night, up the hill.
And did you ever get inside of that fortress?
No.
And throughout your time overseas, did you ever have any close calls yourself?
Well, yes, we're taking the city of Leipzig. And the whole division was moving into this to take the city. It's a pretty large city. And our company ended up somewhere near a German memorial where there were statues and whatnot all around. And we got up to that point and we stopped. And we were stopped because of the heavy fire. And I remember that at some point, one of the German bullets hit my rifle, my BAR, took out a piece of the wooden stock. And I thought at the time, gee, about 3 inches more, that would have been hit. It was just lucky that it was just the rifle. That was.
Close enough.
Anyhow, we ended up taking the town completely and spending a night there.
How long did that battle go on for?
That was about a day and a half.
And this is within the city itself.
Well, coming into the city from the perimeter, yeah.
So since you guys would operate mainly at nighttime,
Yeah.
would you be able to find any time to rest and sleep and
Well, you catnapped whenever you could. I don't remember being deprived, really. No. No, actually, when it came to you've got to take that town for if you want to have dinner tonight and a place to sleep, you have to get into that town and take it. We would do it, and we would pretty much collapse, put out guards, and the rest of us would go to sleep.
so there was an incentive
Yeah.
ahead of you?
If you want to stop living in a shell, in a foxhole, if you want to live in a building, this is your opportunity. Go take that, and you can live in a somewhat civilian life.
Because when you arrived in Europe, it was still winter time. So I imagine
Yeah.
it
Oh,
was
yeah.
still pretty cold outside.
Yeah. 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 When we were in the Hurtgern Forest, there was snow all over the pine trees everywhere, just intense pine trees, and they were full of snow. Yeah. Yeah, we used to heat the pillbox by taking the sea ration can and putting gasoline in and setting it on fire. And that gave us some heat in the pillbox with the wooden structure around. Not very sensible. The fumes were not very good.
Well, got to make a sacrifice somewhere, right?
Yeah.
As if. So, at any point, did the decision of joining the army, did any regrets pop up in your head, or any second thoughts?
No, never had any regrets because we thought we were winning, and we were, of course, but we didn't realize just how much the Germans were retreating and why. And so it was always, they're going to turn on us pretty quick. We better keep moving. And then Patton got in the act. And Patton took our whole division. I guess there were 3 divisions. He took 3 divisions, and here were the retreating Germans here, Americans on this side, Allies, England, Americans, moving toward the Germans who were retreating. And Patton came along, and he took us, and he came around to get behind the Germans, which we did. And that collapsed the whole army at that point. That was pretty spectacular. We moved 100 miles in a week, and it was all well deployed. One day we would ride on a tank. Second day we'd ride on a truck, a 6x truck. The next day we'd walk. The next day there'd be another contrivance of some kind that we'd ride on. And in that week, we went all the way to Kassel, Germany. And we were mostly at that point, as I say, around the back of the Germans, which enclosed and encompassed them and forced them into giving up.
And that was only about a month or so before the war had ended. When you arrived in Kassel.
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
So did you guys encounter any concentration camps or detention camps in your time?
No. No.
Were you aware that they existed, and what was going on as far as that goes?
No, no, we're not. We had not been exposed to any of that.
At what point did you finally become aware that they existed? And is it after you'd returned?
Probably long after we were discharged, and we began hearing about what had happened and what was going on. Some of our division did get to a camp, yeah, but we never heard anything about it until after the war. Yeah, no.
Now, did you ever get homesick at all?
No, I don't think so.
If you had to say what was your toughest day or toughest few days of your time overseas, what would those be?
You remember this is 70 some odd years ago. Well, let's see.
There's no wrong answer.
Toughest days.
I mean, you guys had to give up a lot going over there. Comfort of home, comfort of food, putting your life on the line, losing friends.
Can't come up with the toughest time. Let's see. Might have been on the way over from America to England, where, as I said, we had Thanksgiving dinner on the boat, and this is the North Atlantic, and I was sick as a dog, and I couldn't eat, and anything I ate came up very quickly. I gave up smoking. That was the toughest part of a couple of days that I can think of, yeah.
Now, did you become close with any of the other men in your unit? Did you form any strong bonds with any of them?
Oh yeah, with our squad, yes. Our squad was made up of 12 people, and each one of them had a name, a moniker, and I kept up with them after the war with 3 of the 12. So I was 4th. Yeah, 3 others I was in contact with for quite a while after the war.
Did all the men in your squad survive the war?
Yeah, yeah. Everybody in our platoon was okay, yeah. But in the company, we lost probably 3 or 4 in the whole company.
Do you remember where you were on VE Day when you got word that Germany had surrendered and the war was over in Europe?
No. I don't think we were told very much about it, because I don't recall any special event or feeling exultation about this is the end or whatever. Maybe in Stars and Stripes, a few days after they had completed the surrender, we read about it.
Because at that time, were you guys were just holding your position where you were?
We were in the process of being transferred into the ordnance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then, as we said before, you ended up spending the rest of the year in Europe still.
Yeah, from May till June of 46
Okay.
when I returned.
And what was that year like for you?
Well, it was primarily my experience of driving the Major and becoming very close to him. We became friends as much as we could. And he took a leave and went back to the States. And of course, he wanted to know if my dad was available. He'd be glad to talk to him and tell him about what was going on with me. And sure enough, he went back to the States and they met and they had drinks and dinner and they had a good time together, and he came back and told me about that. But from there on, when he had to go to Paris, I had to drive him, so I got to Paris for the first time after the war. And the rest was just necessary driving for meetings and so forth that he had to go to. So I stayed with him as driver until about 4 or 5 months before I was discharged. So that would be June back to close January of 46, January, February. I moved into a job called the Director of Operations for the group, the 52nd Ordnance Group. And I was the Director of Operations, which meant I was supposed to administer 700 people. Of course, they had all types of levels of authority up and down the line. I was in just an administrative job, that was all. But this was the task of the occupational army in that year of occupation. And the ordnance part of it was to dispose of all of the military equipment. So the ordnance group was charged with dismantling and demolishing vehicles like 6x trucks. They would just cut with a torch. They would cut right through the chassis, and it would they didn't want to leave them for anybody in Europe, and they didn't want to go to the cost of transporting them back, so they just got rid of them. Trucks, Jeeps. What else? Oh, well, of course, then there was the amassing of all the backup equipment like tires and that sort of thing, and wheels. And all the equipment that was used by the operational forces was backed up by ordnance. They had the extra supplies to equip them, and all those supplies had to be gotten rid of. So that's what they did, and I ended up as operations manager, yeah. That was just a lot of paperwork.
And then you eventually returned home.
Yep.
And discharged from the Army.
Mm-hmm. June of 46.
And earlier you mentioned that you dropped out of high school. Did you eventually go back and graduate? Tell me about that.
Well, I came back in June, and it turned out that Curtis High School, where I had started, had a summer program for veterans to finish up high school or add to their high school curriculum. And so I went back to high school for the summer, which was really about 8 weeks, I guess. And during that time, I then earned my diploma. So after I got my diploma, after having spent 3 years in the Army, I decided that an education was important, more important than I'd thought before. So at that point, I applied to Wagner College on Staten Island, where I lived, and the admissions chief was a lady that my sister knew, And so they accepted me on probation as a probational student. And at that point, I got serious about education. And so with enough A's and B pluses, I was able to get 2 years of college at Wagner. And at that point, a friend of mine, a boyhood friend of mine who had been in the Army as well, had come back, and he was in Syracuse University. And so he encouraged me to apply, which I did. They were too heavily involved, too much enrollment. They had no room for anybody. But they did have this adjunct school in Utica called Utica College of Syracuse University. They had two of them, one there and the other in Binghamton, which was another adjunct of Syracuse. So, instead of joining my friend in Syracuse on the main campus, I was in Utica, New York, at the Utica College of Syracuse University. And that was, then I went to school there for 2 years until I graduated, and they graduated the whole class up in Syracuse, along with all of the Syracuse graduates. We were joined, and we were outdoors in an amphitheater somewhere, on the field or wherever. We all had a graduation ceremony there. And that's when I got my diploma. But in the meantime, of course, when I got to Utica to begin with, I was on my own and $75 a month living expenses, which didn't go very far. So I had to take a job. I had to get a job. And a fellow who lived next door to the house where I had rented a room to live, became friendly with him, and his uncle had a business and introduced me, and I began working for them, and I worked for them for 9 years before I left and went to DuPont. But I was working about 30 hours a week. I had 6 8-o'clock classes and still graduated. And in the meantime, I had plenty of money to live on.
And you made a career at DuPont?
Well, I started at DuPont in 1946. No, 56, sorry. 1956 in June. Yeah. And I spent 29 years there. 29 instead of 30 because they had an early retirement plan. They expected, they were downsizing, and they expected if this new plan went through that they would get, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 people to take over the program and retire. That didn't happen. There were 17,000 of us, and so they were really demolished in terms of their structure. This really affected them terribly. And so as a result of that, I became a consultant, went back to work doing the same thing I was doing before, but I was doing it as a consultant. I was living in, where the hell am I? Oh, I was still in Utica, and I was commuting to New York to be this consultant, right? No. Wrong. Where was I? I retired from DuPont. Oh, when I retired, I had lived in Wilmington, New York City, back to Wilmington again, Philadelphia, and then to New York, where I spent my last 12 years with DuPont, living in Manhattan. and I retired to Prescott, Arizona, became a consultant for a year and a half, and every other week I traveled from Prescott to New York to do the same thing I'd done when I was working. This was to fill the void because of so many people who had taken advantage of the retirement plan. So I was commuting every other week to New York, spend a week, go home, spend a week in Prescott, get on the plane, get back to New York, do that same thing.
How long did you keep that up for?
That went on for almost a year. Yeah. Yeah, I built up an awful lot of American airline mileage. I lived pretty well because they paid for my daytime expenses in New York and so forth. Of course, they paid for all the travel and paid me about double of what I was making when I was working as a consultant. Yeah. So I did that for about a year or so. And then that was it.
Great. Now, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we may not have covered? Something that you think is important for your grandkids and future generations to know about you?
Nothing I can think of, no. We covered a lot of territory. No. I really enjoyed the consultant work, even though I had to commute every other week. It was kind of fun. And, no. That's the sad story, I think.
How do you feel when people call you a hero?
Oh, I don't consider myself a hero at all. I notice that's the title. I don't know why you would include me. I was a participant. I was on the front lines. I was in the combat infantry and have a combat infantry badge. But I wouldn't say I was a hero. No.
If you had any advice for my generation or future generations, what could you offer?
Well, as I must say, the one thing I really learned after being in the military was an education was so important, so much more important than I'd thought before, which drove me back to high school and college, and I couldn't advance more or advise more than to say education is the root of the future for everybody.
Well, I want to thank you very much for sitting down with me and sharing your experiences with me, and thank you for your service.
You're most welcome, and for your project, I wish you all the best.